Between 1850 and 1950, something strange happened in at least 7 different locations across the globe. Excavations, scientific expeditions, and accidental discoveries brought human remains to the surface that, according to the records of the time, defied all standards. We are talking about measurements ranging from 7 feet 10 inches to, in some reports, nearly 11 feet tall. The problem isn't just the size, it's what happened next. Virtually all of these finds vanished. They weren't destroyed in wars, nor did they crumble into dust through neglect. They disappeared from institutional collections, museums, and universities. Some were never officially cataloged, others entered internal records only to have their trails go cold. Today, all that remains are questionable photographs, local newspaper reports, letters from archaeologists and anthropologists, and a documentary gap that no one explains satisfactorily. If you believe science preserves everything it finds, this case will bother you. And if you think these finds were obvious hoaxes, you'll have to explain why the respected institutions of the day took them seriously enough to document, measure, and then erase them. If stories like this interest you, if you want investigations that get straight to the point without selling cheap conspiracy theories, subscribe now. Every episode here follows evidence, not guesswork. And if you know someone who enjoys this type of content, share it. The more people investigating together, the better the conversation becomes. Let's get straight to what matters. Today, you'll find out exactly which 7 places these were, what was found in each, and what the documents of the time actually say. Then, we'll investigate why this evidence disappeared, who had an interest in it, and, if there's a less dramatic explanation that still makes sense, in the end, you'll have 3 possible scenarios on the table and can decide for yourself which one convinces you most. We're not selling a ready-made answer. We're going to assemble the chain of facts and let you think. The first question that needs to be clear from the start, when records speak of giant skeletons, what are we talking about? 7 feet? 8? 10? The difference matters. A 7-foot skeleton might be rare, but it's not impossible. Modern populations exist with that average. However, an 8-foot 10-inch skeleton already puts you outside the known curve of human variation. And 10 feet? That requires a completely different explanation. So, throughout this investigation, pay attention to the measurements. They will tell you if we're talking about tall people or something that, in fact, doesn't fit. 1. Lovelock Cave, Nevada, 1911. We begin in Nevada, 1911, Lovelock Cave. It's a dry cave in the middle of the desert, used for centuries by indigenous populations. In 1911, miners began extracting bat guano to sell as fertilizer. As they removed tons of accumulated organic material, they began to find artifacts, bones, and mummies, preserved by the arid climate. They caught the attention of archaeologists from the University of California. Between 1912 and 1924, several formal expeditions investigated the site, and then the reports emerged. According to documents archived at the university and local newspaper reports from the time, human remains were found with measurements far beyond the norm. One record mentions skulls and long bones consistent with individuals standing 7 feet 10 inches tall. Another speaks of mummies that, when stretched out, would reach 8 feet 6 inches. Now here's the problem. Where did these bones go? Officially, most of the Lovelock material was cataloged and is at the University of California Museum of Anthropology and the Nevada State Museum. But the exceptionally sized skeletons? They don't appear in any public catalog. There's an old photo, published in newspapers at the time, showing a massive skull next to a medium-sized one. The difference is shocking. But the photo is never formally authenticated, and the skull is not in any known collection. The obvious question, if it was a hoax, why did serious archaeologists document it? And if it was real, why did it vanish? The orthodox explanation is simple: exaggeration. Miners and journalists of the time inflated the numbers to sell a story. 6-foot bones became 7, and so on. Does it make sense? Yes. But it doesn't explain why, in several cases, the measurements were taken by people with academic training. And it doesn't explain the photo. Could you fake a photo in 1912? Yes. But faking a skull large enough to fool people from a distance using the techniques of the era takes work. And what would be the incentive? 2. Castelnau-le-Lay, France, 1890. Second place. Castelnau, southern France, 1890. George Vacher was an anthropologist, a eugenicist, and a controversial figure. He excavated a Neolithic site and published, in French scientific journals, the discovery of bone fragments with anomalous dimensions. He calculated, based on the femur, that the individual would have stood between 9 feet 3 inches and 10 feet 2 inches. Vacher was a racist, yes. His theories on superior races are absolute garbage. But he knew how to measure bones. The question isn't whether he was a good person. The question is, did he invent the measurement or exaggerate the interpretation? The bones were sent to the Academy of Sciences in Paris. There was internal debate. Some academics questioned the reconstruction. Others accepted it as possible within a margin of error. And then the bones disappeared. There's no record of destruction, no note of disposal. They simply aren't there anymore. The Academy never explained. Theories range from a silent disposal because the find was embarrassing to loss during World War II. But here's the detail. Vacker's publication exists. It is archived. The measurements are there. You can question the interpretation, but you cannot say he invented it out of thin air because other academics saw them. 3. Death Valley, California, 1931, third place, and here things get truly complicated. Death Valley, California, 1931. Bruce Russell was a retired engineer, an amateur miner, and obsessed with local indigenous legends. He claimed that local tribes spoke of an ancient race of giants who lived in underground caves. Russell organized a private expedition and claimed to have found a network of tunnels with mummies up to 8 feet 10 inches tall. He brought photographs and objects and tried to sell the story to museums and universities. No one bought it. Literally. The institutions rejected him. They said the photos were staged, the objects were of doubtful origin, and that Russell had a history of exaggeration. He died in 1942, and all the material he claimed to have found vanished. It didn't go to a museum, a university, or any known private collection. It disappeared. Here, the orthodox explanation is almost certainly that Russell was a con artist. He staged the story to gain money and attention. It makes perfect sense. But then why did he insist until the end? Why did he never admit to fraud, even when it became clear no one was going to pay for anything? People who lie for money usually change strategy when the lie stops paying off. Russell didn't. He died defending the story. This doesn't prove he was right. It proves he believed it, or was willing to die for the lie. Which one? We can't know. But it's worth noting, he isn't the only one. He is one among dozens of amateur and even professional explorers who, between 1880 and 1950, reported similar finds and then couldn't prove a thing. 4. County Antrim, Ireland, 1895. Now, here enters a pattern you'll see in the next locations. Many of these reports appear in newspapers, not scientific journals. And when they do appear in scientific publications, it's almost always in the form of a preliminary communication or a brief note. There's never a full peer-reviewed study with isotopic analysis, carbon dating, or comparison with known populations. Why? The first hypothesis: there was nothing to study. It was all exaggeration, fraud, or measurement error. Second hypothesis: the institutions didn't want to study them. Finds that don't fit the accepted model tend to be ignored, not refuted. Refuting takes work. Ignoring is more efficient. Third hypothesis: the finds were studied, but the results were suppressed. This is the classic conspiracy theory. And before you laugh, remember that scientific institutions have suppressed finds before. Not out of malice, but for politics, fear of controversy, or career protection. Which of these is more likely? It depends on the case. And that's why we need to look at all 7 places before concluding anything. 4th place, County Antrim, Ireland, 1895. There's a famous photo. It shows what appears to be a gigantic skeleton next to a locomotive and several men. The image circulated in British newspapers at the time with the caption, "Irish giant discovered in quarry." The alleged height was 12 feet. A monster. Let's get straight to the point. Is the photo real or a montage? In 1895, photo manipulation already existed. It wasn't trivial, but it was possible. Modern analysis of the image shows inconsistencies in lighting and perspective. The most accepted conclusion is that it was a montage made to sell newspapers. And it worked. The paper sold out. The story spread. And then, no one spoke of it again. But here's the interesting detail. Giant mummies preserved in Irish bogs are a fact. Not 12 feet tall, of course, but 7 feet 2, 7 feet 6, yes. Ireland has a real history of bodies preserved in peat with sizes above the average for the time. This is documented. It's in museums. It's accepted. So when the fake 1895 photo circulated, it leaned on a layer of reality. 12-foot giants? No. Tall people preserved in bogs? Yes. This complicates the analysis. It means frauds mixed with facts. And when you have 10 reports, 8 frauds and 2 real ones, how do you separate them? By the quality of documentation? By the chain of custody? By the existence or absence of independent scientific analysis? And in 1895, almost none of that existed in a standardized way. 5. Ohio Valley, USA, 19th century, 5th place. And here, things get institutional. Ohio Valley, United States, 19th century. Between 1850 and 1900, hundreds of indigenous burial mounds were excavated in the Ohio Valley. Many of these mounds contained human remains, and according to multiple reports published in local newspapers and even communications sent to the Smithsonian Institution, several skeletons measured between 7 feet 2 and 8 feet 6 inches. Did the Smithsonian receive these remains? Yes. It is documented. Letters from senders, shipping receipts, preliminary cataloging notes, all of this exists in the archives. So, where are the skeletons? They aren't on display. They aren't in accessible storage. Officially, the Smithsonian says many human remains were returned to indigenous tribes starting in the 1990s, following the NAGPRA law. This is true. But NAGPRA requires documentation of return. And when independent researchers asked for access to this documentation to check if the giant skeletons were returned, the Smithsonian did not provide a complete list. Why not? According to the institution, old cataloging was inconsistent. Many remains were recorded generically, without detailed measurements. Does it make sense? Yes. But it generates doubt. Because if the skeletons really were over 8 feet tall, that isn't something you forget to record. It's the kind of thing that becomes a note, a study, a scientific curiosity. So either the reports were exaggerated from the start, or there was an active effort to minimize the importance of these finds, or both. Here, it's worth introducing a concept: disposal bias. Scientific institutions discard things all the time. They discard duplicate specimens, poorly preserved material, and finds with no immediate research value. This is normal. The problem is when the disposal isn't documented. And in several cases involving the Smithsonian in the 19th century, the disposal wasn't documented, not because there was a conspiracy, but because there was no protocol. Science was messier, less bureaucratized. This means much was lost simply through disorganization, but it also means that if you wanted to make something vanish on purpose, it was easy. You just didn't catalog it right, or you cataloged it and then forgot where it went. When you have dozens of reports of large skeletons vanishing from institutions, it becomes hard to believe it was all an accident. 6. Gargayan, Philippines, 1950s. 6th place. Gargayan, Philippines, 1950s. Filipino anthropologists, working with support from local universities, excavated pre-colonial sites and reported the discovery of human remains with femurs consistent with individuals standing 7 feet 10 inches tall. The measurements were published in internal bulletins of the University of the Philippines. They didn't become an international article. They didn't become big news, but they are there in the archives. And where are the bones? Destroyed during World War II. Officially. The Philippines was bombed, occupied, and looted. Universities were destroyed. Entire collections vanished. So here, we have a plausible explanation for the disappearance that doesn't involve conspiracy. War destroys evidence. Simple as that. But then why include this case? Because it shows something important. Not every disappearance is mysterious. Sometimes evidence vanishes for mundane reasons. And this further complicates the analysis of the other cases. If war explains the Philippines, what explains Ohio? What explains France? 7. Mitla, Mexico, 1890s. 7th place. Mitla, Mexico, early 1890s. Explorers and amateur archaeologists recorded, in reports published in travel magazines of the time, the discovery of Zapotec burial chambers containing bones of exceptional size. One report mentions bones so large they seem to belong to another species. There is no exact measurement, no clear photograph, no scientific analysis, only the report. Where did these bones go? They never reached an official museum. According to the report, they were taken by private European collectors. And there the trail vanishes. This is the weakest case of the 7. There is practically no solid evidence. But it illustrates a pattern. Many 19th century finds ended up in private collections, not institutions. And private collections have no obligation to open for research. Many were lost over time. Heirs sold them, donated them, or threw them away, and with them went any chance of verifying the story. Patterns and explanations. Now, before we get into why all of this vanished, let's pause and look at what these 7 cases have in common. First, they all happened between 1850 and 1950. Second, they all involve measurements between 7 feet 2 and 12 feet. Third, in none of the 7 does accessible physical evidence exist today. Fourth, in at least 4 of the 7, there was official documentation at the time, made by people with credentials. Fifth, in all 7, the explanation for the disappearance varies, but there is always a documentary gap. Is this a pattern or a coincidence? If you believe in conspiracy, you'll say it's a pattern. Someone was systematically erasing them. If you're a skeptic, you'll say it's a coincidence. Each case has its individual explanation, and none of them withstand scrutiny. And if you're in the middle, you'll say it's probably a bit of both. Some cases were fraud, some were exaggeration, some were real but poorly documented, and some might have been suppressed because they caused discomfort. The truth? We'll probably never know for sure, but we can do something better. We can understand why evidence disappears, who has an interest in it, And what remains when you strip away all the layers of speculation? Why does evidence disappear? Let's start with the most boring and likely explanation: incompetence. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, there was no standardized protocol for storing archaeological finds. Every institution did it their own way. Many small universities didn't even have their own museums. Finds stayed in boxes and basements and classrooms. When a professor died or retired, no one really knew what was stored where. Fires happened, floods happened, rats ate labels, paper deteriorated. And so, bones turned to dust or were thrown out by janitors who had no idea what they were discarding. This explains a lot. It probably explains the majority of cases, but it doesn't explain everything. When you have an exceptional find, an 8-foot 6-inch skeleton, it becomes internal news. Professors talk about it, students study it, visitors come to see it. When something like that vanishes, someone notices, someone asks. And if no one asked, or if they asked and were ignored, then you have a problem that goes beyond incompetence. Second explanation: fraud discovered and erased. Suppose a university receives a supposedly giant skeleton, does an initial analysis, and realizes it's a montage, or the measurements were inflated, or the bones are from a large animal, not a human. What does the institution do? Option 1. Publish the discovery of the fraud, explain the error, educate the public. Option 2. Silently discard it and never speak of it again to avoid embarrassment. Which of the two do you think happened more in 1890? The second. Admitting you were fooled is hard, it makes for bad headlines, it's shameful. So many institutions simply made it go away and moved on. Is this censorship? Not exactly. It's reputation management. And it happens to this day in all fields. The difference is that today, with the internet, social media, and freedom of information, it's harder to erase completely. But in 1900, it was incredibly easy. Third explanation, and here we enter more delicate territory: active suppression for ideological reasons. In the late 19th century, the theory of evolution was consolidating. Darwin had published in 1859. The scientific community was trying to assemble the human evolutionary tree. Within this context, any find suggesting extreme human variation in prehistoric times was complicated. Why? Because the dominant narrative was one of gradual progress. Humans evolved from small to large, weak to strong, savage to civilized. Finding evidence of prehistoric populations with exceptional stature messed with that narrative. It didn't destroy it, but it complicated it. Many academics preferred not to complicate things. They preferred to focus on what fit and what didn't fit. Well, better to set it aside until there was a better explanation. Is this a conspiracy? No, it's institutionalized confirmation bias. It happens in all sciences. You tend to pay attention to what confirms the accepted model and ignore what doesn't, not out of malice, but for cognitive economy. The human brain works this way, and institutions are made of human brains. But there's a difference between ignoring and destroying. Ignoring is passive. Destroying is active. If there was active destruction, someone gave the order. Someone decided. And that decision would leave a trail. Does that trail exist? In some cases, maybe. Let's investigate. The Smithsonian case. The most investigated case in this regard is the Smithsonian. The institution was founded in 1846 and quickly became the primary repository for archaeological and anthropological finds in the United States. During the 19th century, the Smithsonian received thousands of skeletons from indigenous sites. Most were within normal variation, but according to reports published in newspapers of the time, some were exceptional. The question that has never been answered satisfactorily is, what did the Smithsonian do with these exceptional skeletons? The official answer: it treated them like all the others. It cataloged them, studied them when resources were available, stored them, and eventually returned them per the Nagpur law. For most skeletons, this is true. But there is a specific set of finds that doesn't appear in any catalog, not because they were returned, but because apparently they were never properly cataloged from the start. A researcher named Richard Dewhurst spent years investigating this. He compiled dozens of newspaper clippings from the 19th century mentioning discoveries of large skeletons sent to the Smithsonian. When he asked the Smithsonian for access, the response was, "We have no record of these finds." Does this prove a conspiracy? No, it proves a documentary gap. A documentary gap can have 1,000 explanations. But the question remains, if an 1885 newspaper published that the sheriff of County X sent an 8-foot skeleton to the Smithsonian, and the Smithsonian says they have no record of it, who is wrong? Did the newspaper exaggerate? Possible. Did the sheriff lie? Possible. Did the Smithsonian lose it? Possible. Or did the Smithsonian receive it, see it was nothing special, discard it, and decide it wasn't worth recording? Also possible. You see the problem? Each explanation individually is plausible, but when you have 50 such cases, the sum of the individual explanations begins to feel heavy. That's where the theory of systematic suppression arises. This theory suggests that between 1880 and 1920, the Smithsonian received multiple skeletons of exceptional size. The institution realized these finds didn't fit the accepted evolutionary model of the time. So the decision was made not to publicize them, not to study them in detail, and eventually to discard or archive them in a way that they became inaccessible. Why? To protect the paradigm, to avoid public confusion, not to give ammunition to groups questioning evolution. Does it make sense? From an institutional policy standpoint, yes. From an honest science standpoint, no. But institutions don't always operate on honest science. Sometimes they operate on political science. If you find that unlikely, remember, the Smithsonian has been accused in other contexts of minimizing finds that challenged established narratives, not just about giants, but about site dating, population origins, and migration routes. This is documented. It happened. So why would it be impossible for it to have happened with large skeletons as well? It's not impossible. But it's also not proven. And here's the crucial point. Absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, but it's also not evidence of presence. If the skeletons vanished and there's no clear record of what happened, you can speculate as much as you want. But speculation is not investigation. And what we are doing here is investigation. The remaining evidence, photographs. What remains? It remains to look at the cases where evidence didn't vanish completely, where something still exists, and ask, what does that something tell us? For example, the photographs. There are at least 6 widely circulated photographs of supposed giant skeletons. The 1895 Ireland photo we've discussed, it's a proven montage. But what about the other 5? One shows a large skull in Lovelock Cave, Nevada. Another shows an elongated skeleton next to archaeologists in Peru in the 1920s. Another shows long bones being measured in Ohio. Another shows a massive jawbone found in California. And the 5th shows what looks like a giant femur in a temporary exhibition at an unidentified museum. Of these 5, how many are verifiable? None. The Lovelock photo. The skull is not in any known collection. The Peru photo, no exact location identification, no dating, no analysis. The Ohio photo, no corresponding institutional record. The California photo, the jawbone was never seen again. And the museum photo, impossible to identify which museum, when, or what happened after. Does this mean they are all fake? Not necessarily. It means they aren't verifiable. And non-verifiable evidence is, for all practical purposes, useless. You can look at it, find it interesting, but you can't build a solid conclusion on top of it. Myth versus reality. Now, here's a good question. Do you read these cases as metaphor, as distorted historical memory, a mix of both, or something else? There's an interpretation that says, maybe the giants are a cultural memory of something real, but not literally 10-foot skeletons. Maybe they are memories of populations taller than average, or of exceptional leaders buried with special honors whose tombs were larger, which over time became the ancients were giants. Maybe they are memories of encounters with extinct megafauna, like giant bears or ground sloths, whose bones were mistaken for human bones by ancient peoples. Maybe they are even memories of megalithic constructions, where massive stones led to the belief that only giants could have raised them. Are these interpretations valid? Yes. But they don't explain the cases where the measurement was taken by people who knew the difference between a human bone and an animal bone. They don't explain the cases where the photograph, even if unverifiable, clearly shows a human structure, not a bear's. They don't explain the cases where multiple independent witnesses, including doctors and anatomists, attested to the exceptional size. So we return to the question. Either all these reports are fraud or error exaggeration, or at least some are real. And if some are real, what does that mean? If you find a human skeleton 8 feet 6 inches tall with normal proportional anatomy, you have 3 possible explanations. First, pathological gigantism. This is a known medical condition. People with gigantism can exceed 8 feet. But pathological gigantism comes with visible bone deformities. The bones get thick, the joints enlarged, the structure isn't harmonious. In reports that include anatomical descriptions, there is no mention of these deformities. On the contrary, several speak of a well-proportioned skeleton. Second explanation, extreme natural variation. Modern humans vary from 4 feet 7 to nearly 8 feet in extremely rare cases. 8 feet 6 is outside that curve, but not absurdly so. It is statistically improbable, but not impossible. If you have a population of 10,000 people and one of them reaches 8'6" without pathological gigantism, it's rare, but okay. The problem is when you have multiple reports of multiple individuals in multiple places. Then the probability drops significantly. Third explanation, a population with different genetics. This opens a huge box. If you admit there was a prehistoric human population with an average height significantly above normal, you need to explain where they came from, why they disappeared, and why they left no descendants. Interbreeding with Homo sapiens should have left a genetic trace. As far as modern genetics knows, there is no trace of a human lineage with exceptional stature. There are traces of Neanderthals, of Denisovans, but not of giants. So this third explanation, while the most exciting, is the least likely. But it's the one that fuels popular imagination. It's what appears in all the alternative theories. Nephilim, Titans, antediluvian races, Atlanteans, and so on. Let's be fair. The Bible mentions Nephilim. It mentions Anak. It mentions Goliath. The Book of Enoch speaks of giants of absurd heights. But Goliath, according to the most accepted description, was about 9 feet 6 inches. That is biologically possible with pathological gigantism. So, is there a textual basis to believe ancient populations had individuals of exceptional stature? Yes. Is there a basis to believe they were 15 or 20 feet tall? No. That is narrative exaggeration. But here's the trick. Narrative exaggeration doesn't invalidate the real core. If Goliath was 8 feet tall and the narrative became 9'6", it doesn't mean Goliath didn't exist. It means the number was inflated. If you apply this principle to the reports of giant skeletons, what's left? The possibility that individuals and perhaps even populations existed with heights between 7'2" and 8'6", rare but not impossible, and that over time these cases were inflated and mythologized into the legend of 10-foot giants. Final scenarios. Does this solve the mystery? In part. It explains the origin of the legend, but it doesn't explain the systematic disappearance of evidence. If what was found were just skeletons of 7'2" or 7'10", why make them vanish? Why not study, publish, and archive them normally? Tall people exist. It's not scandalous. It doesn't challenge evolution. It breaks no paradigms. Unless what was found were not isolated individuals, but clusters, entire cemeteries, populations. Because then you have a real anthropological problem. You have to explain how an entire population had an average height of 7'6", where they came from and where they went. If you don't have the answer, it's better not to publish, better to wait until you do. And while you wait, better to keep the evidence out of public reach to avoid uncontrolled speculation. Is that what happened? I don't know. But it's the scenario that best explains the pattern of multiple reports, initial documentation, systematic disappearance, absence of scientific publication, and institutional silence. Recapping, we have 7 places where exceptional skeletons were reportedly found. In practically all cases, the physical evidence disappeared. The explanations vary: incompetence, discovered fraud, ideological suppression, war loss, sales to private collectors, undocumented disposal. No single explanation is absurd. But the pattern of disappearance in multiple cases raises legitimate questions. What remains is to ask, if someone found an 8'6" skeleton today, what would happen? Would it be studied, published, or discreetly archived to avoid confusion? The honest answer is, it depends. If the skeleton comes from a clear archaeological context, with carbon dating and DNA analysis, it would be studied. It would be published. Today, science has the tools to deal with anomalies. If it was pathological gigantism, it would be detected. If it was extreme natural variation, it would be documented. If it was something completely unexpected, like an unknown human lineage, it would be the discovery of the century. But no one is finding these skeletons today. Not because they aren't looking. Archaeologists excavate all the time. And they aren't finding 8'6" skeletons. They're finding skeletons within the expected variation. I personally land somewhere between the second and third scenarios. I find it unlikely that every report was pure fraud. I believe there were individuals of exceptional stature, and over time these cases were inflated. But I also think the total absence of verifiable physical evidence today is too suspicious to be just a coincidence. There was likely a combination: real finds, narrative exaggeration, institutional disposal out of disinterest or policy, and accidental loss. It isn't sexy, it doesn't make for a movie, but it is what the available evidence suggests. What these 7 places teach us isn't about giants. It's about how narratives form, how a real find, plus a measurement error, plus journalistic exaggeration, plus institutional bias, can turn into a legend. And once it becomes a legend, it's almost impossible to separate the factual core from the mythological bloat. If this kind of investigation makes sense to you, if you enjoy exploring mysteries without falling into shallow conspiracy or lazy skepticism, you know what to do. Subscribe, comment on what you think, share it with those who like to think. This content doesn't live on hype. It lives on people who really want to understand. Next week, we investigate another case everyone talks about, but no one has checked properly. And this time, the physical evidence still exists. It'll be different. Until then, The question remains, if you were the director of the Smithsonian in 1890 and you received an 8'6" skeleton you couldn't explain, what would you do? Would you publish it and risk becoming a laughingstock? Study it in silence until you had a solid answer. Or archive it and forget it. Think about that. Would you like me to adapt this narrative into a more formal documentary script format, or perhaps focus on one of these specific locations for a deeper dive?